Hello. Although Benjamin Franklin was born and raised in Boston, Massachusetts, there is another city that lays claim to the founder, Philadelphia. He moved there in 1723 at the age of 17, quickly finding his feet as a printer and later leaving his mark with a number of civic projects that helped put Philadelphia on the map. I'm your host, Henry Wilkinson, and today we'll be moving the focus of our podcast away from Franklin in Boston to Franklin in Philadelphia. In this episode, I'm joined by two very special guests who have the mammoth task of not only introducing us to 18th century Philadelphia, but also two of the institutions founded by Franklin in the city, the University of Pennsylvania and the Pennsylvania Hospital. Our first guest is John Pollack, Senior Curator at the Kislak Center for Special Collections, Rare Books and Manuscripts at the University of Pennsylvania. Our second guest is Jim Duffin, Assistant University Archivist, also at the University of Pennsylvania. John and Jim, hello.
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 Pleasure to have you here today to talk to us all about Benjamin Franklin, the founder, and his time in Philadelphia. We've heard all about his early life in the city of Boston, and now we're going to be moving to Philadelphia, his second home. So, to introduce our audiences to this fabulous 18th century city, I wonder if you could tell us, what was Philadelphia like in the 18th century?
Thank you for having us, and greetings to everybody. We're going to take a journey here into Philadelphia in the early 1700s. And one of the first things to say is that Philadelphia is a famous city now, but it was a very small city in the 18th century. It was a port town in one of the English colonies in North America, and most people probably would have described it as provincial. So here we're talking about the early 1700s up to maybe the 1720s, which is when Benjamin Franklin, of course, arrives. It was a small population. It was a town. I'm not even sure it's worth calling it a city yet. A town that was heavily dependent on shipping and commerce for its economy, with lots of connections, both to the Atlantic world, but also to large rural regions, farming regions around it. It was probably not yet really a place that saw itself as part of a big commercial empire. That would come later. I guess one point to make is that Philadelphia had only been founded in 1681. That was the year that William Penn was granted his charter for the colony of Pennsylvania. And in the following year, so 1682, William Penn surveyors laid out this town called Philadelphia between two rivers, the Delaware and the Schuylkill. Visitors to Philadelphia would have, I think, been surprised by its layout, very grid plan. Some have argued it's a very utopian plan with wide streets, very unlike the crooked streets of Boston that Benjamin Franklin would have known, or London for that matter. And it was a city where many of the houses were built of brick, which has to do with the clay and the geology of the local region here, but also turned out to be relatively effective at limiting fires, the spread of fire. And fire is a topic we may come back to later, because that's always a danger for early modern cities. So that's where what might Philadelphia sort of look like in the early 1700s.
Very quickly, you mentioned William Penn. He was British, and Pennsylvania was a proprietary state. Is that correct? Or colony, rather?
Yes. What is a proprietary state, Jim?
A proprietary colony or state is basically one in which the individuals were given full rights and powers over the colony by the crown. So it meant that basically William Penn and his descendants, they owned all the land in Pennsylvania and could sell it off and collect quit rents for that. They also had full power over government. They granted charters for the creation of assemblies and cities. Also, they had full power over appointments of officials, governmental officials, judges, tax collectors, and so forth. So it was basically a colony which was within the full hands and power of the Penn family, which was distinct from other colonies in British North America, which were called royal colonies, which basically were under the control of London and the 18th century equivalent of the Foreign Office there and the king, who appointed governors. The Penn family appointed the governors of Pennsylvania. They granted the political rights to Pennsylvania. So they were sort of the ultimate authority in Pennsylvania.
And I'm sure we'll hear more about that as well, with Franklin being sent to London to see the Penn family. But very quickly, I wonder if you could also tell us about how the city or town, as you said, changed over the 18th century. What made it become part of, or how did it get to where it is today?
Yeah, I think we could, not to overuse this tired Dickensian phrase, but nevertheless call it a tale of two cities, because what Philadelphia was in the early 1700s and what it became by the mid 18th century, the mid 1700s, are two very dramatically different places, which is to say that Philadelphia underwent profound economic, social, and physical transformations. And during Franklin's lifetime and his residence there, he would have seen all of this. For example, when Franklin arrived, there were about 5,000 inhabitants in what the urbanized area of the city, which was quite small. By the time of the American Revolution, there were about 30,000. Now, those are small numbers by modern standards, of course, but we're talking about a city that had, grown in size by 5 or 6 times. Everybody noticed this. It really changed what Philadelphia was in an extraordinary way.
And I would also add that by that number that John quotes at the time of the Revolution points out that Philadelphia was the largest city in British North America at the time. So it isn't a large number by today's standards, but by the standards of British North America, it was a very large city.
And with that growth came all kinds of challenges, many of which Franklin and others around him would need to address. Economic challenges, educational challenges, other social challenges, and conflicts as well. Maybe just a quick point of comparison on the numbers, since you've been talking about Franklin in Boston. Boston was larger than Philadelphia at the beginning of the century by quite a bit, but it did not grow nearly as quickly. So by the American Revolution, there were about 20,000 residents of Boston. So it was, again, by the later 1700s, significantly smaller than Philadelphia. So Philadelphia was the boom town, you could say, of British North America.
And you could argue Benjamin Franklin was one of those first immigrants to come to Philadelphia. But what brought him to the city, and what did he do when he got there?
Absolutely agree that he was one of, could be considered an immigrant, a runaway, a refugee. Maybe any of these labels might describe him. He arrived on October 6th, 1723. For those of you who listened to the episode on Boston, you would know that, of course, Benjamin Franklin was a printer and apprenticed to his brother, James Franklin. Through a complex series of arrangements, Benjamin Franklin had stepped in James's place to avoid some of the censorship restrictions in Boston, and the New England Current was being printed under Benjamin Franklin's name. But to make a long story short, being upset with the treatment that he received from his brother, took advantage of their renegotiated indenture contract and decided essentially to leave Boston, to run away. He shows up a morning in Philadelphia, and many years later wrote about that arrival in his autobiography. And I'll read it quickly. I walked up the street, gazing about, till near the market house I met a boy with bread. I had made many a meal on bread, and inquiring where he got it, I went immediately to the baker's he directed me to in 2nd Street, and asked for biscuit, intending such as we had in Boston. But they, it seems, were not made in Philadelphia. Then I asked for a 3-penny loaf, and was told they had none such. So, not considering or knowing the difference of money and the greater cheapness nor the names of this bread, I bade him give me 3-penny worth of any sort. He gave me accordingly 3 great puffy rolls. I was surprised at the quantity, but took it, and having no room in my pockets, walked off with a roll under each arm and eating the other. Thus I went up Market Street as far as 4th Street, passing by the door of Mr. Reed, my future wife's father. when she, standing at the door, saw me and thought I made, as I certainly did, a most awkward, ridiculous appearance. Then I, coming round, found myself again at Water Street Wharf, near the boat I came in, to which I went for a draught of the river water, and being filled with one of my rolls, gave the other two to a woman and her child that came down the river in the boat with us, and were waiting to go farther. Thus refreshed, I walked again up the street, which by this time had many clean-dressed people in it, who were all walking the same way. I joined them, and thereby was led into the great meeting house of the Quakers near the market. I sat down among them, and after looking around a while and hearing nothing said, being very drowsy through labor and want of rest the preceding night, I fell fast asleep, and continued so till the meeting broke up, when one was kind enough to rouse me. This was therefore the first house I was in or slept in Philadelphia. So I love that long episode there because you get a sense of Franklin's arrival at the wharf. You get a sense of the economy and the fact that his money, Boston money, went a long way and he could buy a lot of bread. Philadelphia was in a sort of agricultural depression during the 1720s. And of course, you get a sense of the important population of Quakers in the city and the Great Quaker Meeting House, the largest building at that time in Philadelphia, right up on Market Street. He walks in. Quaker meetings, of course, were silent until someone was moved to speak. And so the meeting being silent, he falls asleep. He had never been in a Quaker meeting before. So he sums up a lot of the social life around Philadelphia in that lovely little episode, I think.
And the Quakers had a big impact on how he conducted his own sort of his junto and philosophical debates, that kind of thing. Are you able to talk on the Quaker influence on his general life?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think Philadelphia and Pennsylvania more generally were very diverse places. At the same time, there was a Quaker force, a hierarchy, that really made this colony and this city unique. Quakers had been in power since Penn's time, of course, and they still were. They controlled the Pennsylvania Assembly, which met in Philadelphia. They controlled a lot of the institutions of the city, and a number of them had become very successful and prosperous merchants. So they also had economic power.
And I would just also add that the Quaker meetings themselves were very well organized and structured, unlike some of the other groups that took time to get things set up. So they came in basically with their meetings already organized, their commercial networks already organized because they traded with other Quakers in England. And so they had a real head start over a lot of other groups that came in.
I think Franklin quickly realizes that, yes, he needs to associate with and make friends with the Quakers in the city, and he does so. He makes a number of very close acquaintances who help him in town with his business affairs, with his civic projects, and even when he goes to London and gets into a scrape because the governor doesn't help him in the way that he had been expected to be helped later in the 1720s. A very important Quaker merchant named Thomas Denham also assists him there. So you're absolutely right. Quakers in Philadelphia are crucial for Franklin. He'll become a political ally of members of the Quaker Assembly too in the 1740s and 1750s. And as Jim was implying, but not yet stating directly, there's a growing conflict between some of the Quaker families in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania and the proprietary leaders of the colony, the descendants of William Penn back in England. They were all Quakers originally, but there is a schism that develops, a very important political schism that develops between those two sides, which really dramatically reshapes the colony over time.
And we'll hear more about Franklin's journey to London for the first time when we talk to Jim Green at the Library Company, who's going to tell us a bit about Franklin's printing career. But you mentioned as well that the Quakers helped Franklin with some of his civic pursuits. So I wonder, what else did Franklin do in Philadelphia? And when did he start giving back to the people that had welcomed him into the city? What kind of institutions did he bring?
Yeah, this is an important point. And I think one phrase that we could use to help answer it is one that historians have employed, voluntary civic association. Simple enough, but an interesting concept. Voluntary civic associations essentially gatherings, groups, clubs of citizens formed for civic purposes. In a small city like Philadelphia, with very little civic infrastructure, it turned out that it was basically clubs of people, mainly men, but not only men, who gathered, who essentially formed themselves and formed projects for civic reform in mind. This is really how Philadelphia developed a lot of the institutions that made it successful and even made it famous in the 18th century. Perhaps the first one to mention is a little club of readers that Franklin and a couple of his friends formed called the Junto. The Junto is essentially a reading club and a club to discuss ideas. And you may hear more about the Junto when you hear James Green talk about Franklin and printing, but a club of young men sharing books, sharing ideas, out of which projects develop. For example, the Library Company, the first circulating library in America, but many others as well. The American Philosophical Society, which is founded in 1743, a fire company and multiple fire companies.
Fire insurance.
Fire insurance, essentially a scheme by which people can pool their money to insure their dwelling and ensure that firemen would come to put out a fire in your house if you paid your insurance. Militia companies to defend the city and the colony were also civic projects. So, and other insurance schemes as well. So there's a whole range of civic projects. Not all of these are led by Franklin. We'll talk about the hospital and the university specifically in a couple of minutes. But I think it's absolutely correct to say that Franklin was a strong force behind many of them. And he is very proud of how his influence could bring people together. He likes to say that he didn't want the credit for these inventions, these civic projects. He just wanted them to succeed. So he didn't want to set himself as the director or leader of all of them. He just wanted to bring people together and pool their resources and their influence to bring in other people. I think that's one of the points to make about voluntary civic associations. They help a city govern itself where there was not a strong government or any really civic associations in power at all up to that point.
Yeah, and one thing I would add is traditionally the church was involved in certain charitable activities, but because no one religion dominated here, the Quakers had some strength. So the reality is, in order to do a lot of charitable things, like we'll hear about the hospital, you had to, no one particular denomination or religion could do that. You had to pool resources. And so it created this idea that we always have to kind of work together because there's not enough of us to, dominate something. And so that had profound, and then it basically spread to all aspects of civic life as a result.
So we've been talking about Franklin's civic role in Philadelphia. We're going to hear from the Library Company and the American Philosophical Society in future episodes. But the reason that you're both with us today is because of the University of Pennsylvania. So I was wondering if you could perhaps tell us about how Franklin founded it, why it was founded, and what his vision was for this institution that you are working in today.
Yeah. I'm going to start with a little bit of nomenclature, terms and names, because this can get confusing, and we'll circle back to these. The name University of Pennsylvania, our current university's name, was not adopted till the very end of the period we're going to be talking about. The school had other names before that, and you'll hear us using those names. It begins as the Academy of Philadelphia. It becomes the Academy and Charitable School of Philadelphia, and then it becomes the Academy, College, and Charitable School of Philadelphia, a three-legged, three-branched organization. We'll try to explain those three branches as we go. But maybe our story is best started around 1749 with Benjamin Franklin, of course. Just the year before that, Franklin had essentially given up active management of his printing business. You could call it a kind of retirement. He was still, of course, involved and got revenues from printing, but he wasn't actively managing the day-to-day work. He turned that over to his partner, David Hall. He had money and he had more time to devote to some of the civic projects we were talking about. And one of the projects he had long envisioned, he tells us, was the creation of a school, an academy. Now, you might remember that Franklin himself was from humble origins, but he was thinking of a real formal school. The phrase he used, his desire was for a school that would provide for the complete education of youth in the colony. It's interesting to think about what he meant by that term. Franklin would have known that other schools existed already in the city. Most of those were run by the Quakers. They were neighborhood schools providing basic literacy, numeracy education, and there was a central academy, which was kind of a high school that focused on higher, slightly higher and more advanced education. It wasn't only for Quakers, but it was essentially dominated by the Quaker elite. And Franklin was thinking about all the other newer inhabitants of the city and how a school could benefit them. So in 1749, he essentially made a pitch to recruit donors and trustees, wealthy individuals, for this new educational project. He had a pamphlet printed. He knew how to use print and print culture as a fundraising tool. And he had a pamphlet that was called Proposals Relating to the Education of Youth in Pennsylvania printed. He printed this anonymously, did not put his name on it, and he had it distributed among some of the wealthier citizens of the city. And in that pamphlet, he set forth a scheme, a plan for a school, and his ideas about what the school would do. He actually proposed a pretty wide pedagogical platform. It would include ancient and modern authors. It would teach writing. It would teach oratory, drawing, accounting, the sciences, and mathematics. It would also teach history and even modern languages. He also talks about how the students should get exercise, how they should live and eat together, and maybe even wear school uniforms. So he was also thinking about some of the social aspects of education. So we consider this kind of the starting point of the school, and we'll talk a little bit how it develops from there.
So Franklin's put out a pamphlet advertising this potential school. How does he source the staff to teach all of these subjects, and who is eligible to potentially study there?
Absolutely. Of course, the first job is to raise money, and it seems like he successfully did this within about a year. He'd raised enough funds to and gathered enough support to form a board of trustees. That board essentially put together a constitution, an official document, statement of purpose.
And I would add that the board that he formed was leaders of all the different sort of major constituencies within the city.
So he was really smart about balancing different power groups, you might say, or factions or interests within the city. One thing we might just say right here, which is very important for the history of this school, is that it was non-denominational. Now, that's not the same thing as saying it was secular, but what it means is that different religions were represented on the original board of trustees.
And unlike all the other colonial colleges in British North America at this time, this school was not tied to a particular church. Like Princeton University was tied to the Presbyterians, King's College or Columbia to the Anglican Church, and Harvard and Yale were each tied to their respective dominant faiths in those areas, and also primarily trained people to become ministers.
Essentially what happens is it starts as a school that is teaching what we would call children and teenagers, but Franklin and the trustees by the mid-1750s open a college for an undergraduate population, older teenage boys. And the college is essentially added on to the academy, and both function together. And some students, many we think, actually started at the academy level, where they might have been 8 or 9 years old, and move into the collegiate level when they get older. The third branch, which I mentioned quickly, is worth noting here, a charity school. What was that? And specialists of English history will know something about charity schools because they existed in England before they existed in the colonies. It's essentially a school for younger children to teach basic reading and writing and mathematics for people who could not pay for any schooling. This was considered a civic work and was something that this institution also founded, was part of the institution into the 19th century. There's a little story here we can tell quickly. These trustees, of course, had to acquire a building. where were they going to teach the school? Where was it going to run? And they purchased a building that was confusingly called the New Building. The New Building had been built a few years before in 1740 as a kind of hall for visiting preachers. And this building existed, but it was not being used very much. In fact, it really was a bit of a debt burden to the people who owned it. So they were willing to negotiate with Franklin and the other trustees so that the new school, the new academy, could acquire it in 1750. And that became where the Academy College and Charity School set up its base. One of the quibbles that people at this university have is about our founding date. And if you buy a University of Pennsylvania t-shirt, it will proudly announce that we were founded in 1740. However, we were talking about 1749 as the date of Franklin's proposals and this plan for a school. So you could, and people have argued about this, the date 1740 comes from the date when the building was built, even though there was no school there until 1749, 1750.
And one important thing to also mention about the charity school, that it was for both boys and girls. Yeah. Whereas all the other schools, the academy and the college, were for boys only. And it wasn't until the 19th century that women were admitted to the college.
I wonder if there were any famous alumni of the 18th century who attended either the academy and or what would become the college, the university. Are there any famous, I don't know, what would you call an alumni of the school?
Yeah. Yeah. The Penn people, yeah.
Obviously, we had a number of early graduates who went into fight in the Revolution and had some important standing within the military. They're names that are kind of very obscure, even to Americans. So it's hard to put together a whole list. I think one early graduate that certainly received some really important regional and some would say national fame was a man named Francis Hopkinson. And I think John can talk about him a little bit.
Right. Hopkinson was in the first graduating class of the college. So he was one of the small group who made it up to this sort of higher level of this pyramid that we were talking about that represented the institution. That graduating class was 1757. And Hopkinson was a nice example of almost a polymath, interested in many different sorts of things. He was a trained musician, and he's considered to be America's first musician born here, born on this continent. He wrote popular songs. He also had a legal career, and he signed the Declaration of Independence as a delegate from New Jersey. So he's deeply involved in the political, social, and cultural life of his city, of the colony, and of the colonies more generally.
And I believe he may have also been provided one of the designs for the seal of the United States as well. So he became active in national or federal politics when Philadelphia was the capital of the United States in the 1780s and 90s. One of the other graduates of that class was the person who went on to found our medical school, who was really sort of a rising academic star, very smart young man that people saw a lot of promise for. He didn't come from a very wealthy family. He studied medicine. He went to Scotland to study medicine. And then after he came back from Scotland with his medical degree, he proposed forming a medical school here. So it's very fascinating to kind of look at that very first class of graduates and see some really important people that had profound effects on the history of this institution, but also the area.
You said he started or helped found the medical school. Was that linked in any way to the Pennsylvania hospital?
It is linked, and maybe we can sum up quickly the story of the founding of Pennsylvania Hospital.
Another Franklin institution.
Another Franklinian institution, absolutely. If people Google the University of Pennsylvania today, you'll find out that the Pennsylvania Hospital is one part of the university's medical system. So it's one hospital of many, of course, in the modern city, and the University of Pennsylvania has its own hospital, and there are lots of others. So that merger was recent, 1997. But if we look back to the 18th century, the story is a little different. And the hospital is one of those civic institutions, like the university, like the others we've mentioned, that was founded within a short span of time by a number of prosperous citizens, with Franklin leading the way. Again, let's talk about the growing city of Philadelphia. But Philadelphia had a very limited charity network. There was an almshouse that the Quakers were in charge of, but the means were limited. And it was clear that that was an inadequate system by the mid-18th century. Who would look after the sick people, and poor sick people in particular, who couldn't be attended by physicians in their own homes? How
they may not have had families here to provide network.
Right, or this huge immigrant population that Jim mentioned. How are they to be looked after? That, along with a growing interest in science in places like Philadelphia, in medicine and in medical education, those factors kind of come together to create an interest in building a hospital. There was a leading doctor in Philadelphia, a man named Thomas Bond, who met with Franklin. They actually probably came up with this plan at the American Philosophical Society, which you'll hear about, a plan to fundraise for a hospital. And Thomas Bond, tried to recruit subscribers, which is an 18th century word for funders, for a hospital that would, in Franklin's words, look to the reception and cure of poor sick persons, whether inhabitants of the province or strangers. To Jim's point, had to look after everybody. Now, this is, I think, a nice example of Franklin's fundraising genius. He was a good publicizer and he was a good fundraiser. The Pennsylvania Assembly was skeptical and didn't want to contribute money to this project. It seems like, and this is still a problem even in contemporary Pennsylvania, there was a division between those who represented country interests and those who represented city interests. And the country delegates were always reluctant to give money for the city. That is still a problem in modern Pennsylvania, by the way. But Franklin came up with a fascinating idea. He convinced the Assembly to give £2,000 if subscribers could match that amount.
It's the old match.
It's the old match donation campaign, right, which we're so familiar with nowadays. But this was a new idea. And according to Franklin, people in the Assembly agreed to do this because they thought that no one would ever raise that much money. So they would be...
It gave them political cover. Right. Sure, I'm not against a charitable thing, but you'll never raise this money.
You're never going to do it. But Franklin also understood that it actually is a great incentive for donors if your donation will be matched, right? American listeners will know that, public radio, this is how public radio is funded to this day. Many other charitable schemes, nonprofits, work with donor matches and fundraising of this kind. So this is one of the earliest examples, and it worked. They raised the money. The Assembly gave its portion, and they had enough money to acquire land really on the edge of the city, 8th and Pines, kind of the outskirts where they could acquire a pretty substantial plot of land, build a lovely building, which you can still visit in Philadelphia. That building opened around 1755. And then when the medical school was founded a decade later, the medical students who could attend lectures and then practice,
have their clinical training at the hospital.
Yeah. So the two worked absolutely together, and Franklin would absolutely have been very happy with this arrangement.
So just saying, the hospital opened 1755, is that?
Yes.
And we often say, and I'm sure this is true, I just don't know the history well enough, that it is the first hospital in the United States. So it was another one of these firsts of Franklin, and related to, and again, it's kind of back to our initial point of the context of Philadelphia. We're growing so fast. We're dealing with all these kind of issues. We have to do something more on scale to deal with this. And so we have to have a hospital, just like we have to have a college, an academy, and so forth.
So the Pennsylvania Hospital, that was founded in 1755. And a few years later, in 1757, Franklin would leave Philadelphia to spend some time in London, where he would be representing the people of Pennsylvania in front of their proprietors, the Penns. So I was wondering if you could tell us, during this period that extends right up until 1775, Franklin in London, what happens in his absence, and is there anything going on that relates back to the university?
The most significant thing that happened during this period was the founding of the medical school,
which really is, for a long time, the most successful part of the university. It attracts students from all over the colonies and beyond, the Caribbean as well, and gets an important reputation really quite quickly.
And has, not only is it the first medical school in British North America. But it ends up establishing Philadelphia as sort of a center of medicine, a legacy that still exists today. Our medical school and our health system is a very large part of the university and had very important, profound effects on the future development of this university and institution.
And looking out the window, we can see that all the tall buildings to the south of us are all medical school. Those are the large buildings on this campus, and more being built even as we speak.
So that was the most significant thing that happened in the lead up to the Revolutionary War. Is that what you're saying? That the medical school was the big achievement in those years?
Yeah, I would say so, absolutely.
And then what happened during the war itself? What happened to the city of Philadelphia? We heard in Boston that there was an evacuation, things shut down, the British came in, occupied. But what happened in Philadelphia, and what happened to these institutions during the war?
This is an important question. Of course, Philadelphia will, although not initially on the leading edge of the revolutionary cause, the way Boston was, will of course become the center of the revolution and the place of the writing of the Declaration, of course, Declaration of Independence.
So we sit basically in the middle of like all the colonies, so it became a natural place, and also being the largest city, that people from all the different colonies chose to gather here to have their discussions about what should we do.
Right. Just stepping back quickly to sort of lead into this period of tremendous change and turmoil, we could start with a figure that everyone knows at least something about, Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine arrives in the 1770s as an unknown radical figure whose background was rather mysterious in England.
And sent to us by Franklin.
Had an endorsement from Benjamin Franklin and arrives really just a couple of years before 1776. He publishes some magazine articles, gets involved with politics, and seems to have gotten to know some of the teachers and members of the school, members of the university, who were also thinking about what was going on in politics and the growing breach between the colonies and Great Britain over subjects we'll know about: taxation, import duties, and the whole question of parliamentary rule and royal authority. These were the questions that were starting to dominate the conversation in the 1770s, and that were really starting to drive a wedge between elites who had a lot of loyalty to Britain and some of the more popular classes. This would really reshape the politics quite a lot. Jim and I think that Thomas Paine was in active conversation with some figures at Penn, at the institution, particularly a man named James Cannon, who was a math professor, and another doctor named Benjamin Rush in the medical school. And the same moments that he wrote Common Sense. Common Sense was printed in January 1776, and it's one of the factors that helped drive the push for separation, for independence. There had already been violence and conflict between the colonies and Great Britain in 1775, but things really come to a head in 1776. And it's in Philadelphia with a small group of radicals who take the lead in pushing for independence and pushing the Continental Congress, which had been meeting by this point, to take a bold, dangerous step of declaring independence.
And Thomas Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense, to use modern terms, essentially went viral when it was published, because a lot of people had been right after some of the initial battles in around Boston and the British Army occupying there. And so people were like very upset. And Thomas Paine presented the case for independence in a very clear way that resonated with people at that time. And as a result, his pamphlet, which was published here in Philadelphia, was sold out immediately and went through many editions. And so it was very clear that it was something that resonated with a lot of people. A lot of people wanted it. And a lot of historians would say, it wasn't like the single factor, but it was a really important factor pushing people later that year in 1776 to decide that we should sign this Declaration of Independence.
So Paine is, again, not directly part of the university, but very closely, a near neighbor. and he becomes celebrated as a hero once the Declaration has happened. The Revolutionary University granted Thomas Paine an honorary degree. So he does have a certain claim as a Penn graduate.
Yeah.
So what happens? What happens in Philadelphia, and what happens to the school? We'll try to sum this up quickly, but essentially by later 1776, the British are threatening Pennsylvania and threatening Philadelphia.
They're in New York.
And they're in New York. Things are really changing radically. There is, of course, a new state government, a revolutionary government that has taken power after the Declaration. It's a new leadership, a group of individuals who had never been part of the governing coalition before, new men with new ideas.
Really sort of radical ideas, even at the time they were thought of it, in the sense that they created in Pennsylvania, there was no governor. It was just a legislature. That was it. All the power was directly voted in by the people, a single body of legislature that would be reelected every year.
Pennsylvania had the most democratic of all the new state constitutions in terms of who was allowed to vote, very open franchise, and the strict limits on authority and power, and lots of power vested in this legislature. Annual elections, which turned out to bring a certain amount of chaos with them. But this was, and there were people from the university, particularly a man named James Cannon, this mathematics professor, and another named David Rittenhouse, who was a scientist and would become a leader of the school, very influential in forming this new Pennsylvania Constitution. Some of you may know that Philadelphia is occupied soon after. Before that, the school is essentially closed by the revolutionary government. Soldiers are quartered in the school buildings. But by June 1777, the British have occupied the city. And there's no schooling between June 1777 and September 1778. The soldiers.
And the army and the British Army uses the college buildings as a hospital for soldiers.
So you might wonder what happens to the former leaders. All of this kind of gets worked out after the occupation of the city is done, after the British evacuate the city. That happens toward the end of 1777, and
they return to New York.
They return to New York, and the Pennsylvania Assembly is again left with the task of governing Philadelphia. So what happens? Well, and how is this new government going to deal with the old leaders of the school who are still around? 1779 is not a year that people think about too much in the Revolution, but we think it's a really important year because it was a huge year of incredible social conflict. There's hyperinflation. There are riots against some of the leading merchants, essentially bread riots.
And people are attainted as traitors for supporting or helping the British Army, and some of whom their property is seized.
So it's a moment of incredible turmoil in the community. And who among those who are suspected is William Smith. William Smith, the provost, an Anglican minister, Church of England. The whole Church of England structure came under deep suspicion. And William Smith was one of the people essentially accused of loyalism. So essentially, the new leaders of Pennsylvania make a radical step in 1779. They turn their attention to the university and what should become of it. And they pass legislation that essentially voids all of the previous charters that had governed the school. And it declares that the institution had been managed by what were called dangerous and disaffected men, who have provoked tumult, sedition, and bloodshed. So this is really the new leaders of the state declaring the old elites traitors. And
a little bit of French Revolution.
A little bit of French Revolution stuff. It sounds a lot like the French Revolution. Americans, I don't think, are used to thinking about their revolution in those terms, but this is, you're either with us or you're against us. There was no...
And they even had loyalty oaths that everybody had to swear. Even college professors had to swear loyalty oaths to the independence and the state constitution.
So something that's remarkable in the history of this school is that in 1779, the board is just completely reformed and the school is remade. It is even given a new name. So remember how we said that the original name of the school was the College Academy and Charitable School of Philadelphia. The school is renamed the University of the State of Pennsylvania. the University of the State of Pennsylvania.
No longer Philadelphia.
No longer Philadelphia. It's university for everybody, for this new state in particular. And they took this seriously. The new leaders, the new board of trustees, had a whole new group of people in it. One of the mandates that was that the new board would really be religiously diverse in a way that might have pleased Benjamin Franklin, actually. So the senior ministers of all the leading religious denominations were given a seat on the board. That does include the Anglicans, the Episcopalians, but also Presbyterians, Baptists, Lutherans, German Reformed, and Catholic. This is remarkable. There's no other school with this kind of broad-based board. But as Jim just said, everybody had to swear allegiance to the new Pennsylvania Constitution. So politically, no dissent was allowed at all.
Yeah.
We don't know, I don't think, really what Benjamin Franklin thought about this school. He was obviously very central to the politics, but he was doing other things of greater importance, working in France, of course. So I don't think we have a lot of direct evidence of how he felt about the school during this period.
And how is Franklin remembered at the university today? Do you talk often about him, or is he a quiet reminder of the start of the institution?
Or I should say, I would say, when do we not talk about it?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, because actually he's a pretty persistent presence, at least in the kind of cultural memory of the school. You can see his face on T-shirts and on banners. He's often evoked by the university's leaders.
We have a big statue of him in front of our main college administration building.
So to that extent, he is the founder. So Franklin is ubiquitous. There's a wonderful sculpture of Franklin on a bench that's on the main walk of the campus that people can sit on next to Benjamin Franklin, get their picture taken.
It's even incorporated into student rituals, which we won't describe for radio.
Yes, things that happen late at night that are best not talked about here. Mascots of Franklin at athletic events. So I'd say that Franklin is absolutely part of the memory, but not surprisingly, at the same time, there may not be that much intensive discussion about what Franklin really did or what he really thought.
So it sounds like he is all over the place and very much a symbol of the university.
And as he is a symbol of Philadelphia, it will be interesting to think as this conversation will air in 2026, Franklin's role in those nation-shaping debates and in the debates around this school. Franklin is a figure at Penn and in Philadelphia, who does remain central to the imaginary and whose work is still being thought about, debated, argued with, whose life is still being studied, argued with. He's still a figure really worth thinking about.
And I would also add that the thing about Franklin is, of like all the founding fathers, I guess maybe perhaps the University of Virginia and Thomas Jefferson, it's like none of the other, particularly among the Ivy League schools, and those are basically the schools that were founded before the Revolution here in America. None of them have like a founder that has a household name that they can quote to. I mean, sure, Harvard can talk about the Harvard donation, or Yale about the Yale donation, but most Americans know who Benjamin Franklin is. And so we're very fortunate that we have a founder that has a household name. And also, I've been impressed in terms of like how he's actually a very fascinating individual who's carried over time and withstood the varying interpretations of the past. And somehow Franklin always comes out and kind of on the right side of things. He has his flaws, and it's good over time that we see more of them and understand them more. But ultimately, at the end of the day, he was a very moral character, had an open mind, was very much into science and learning. And it's the kind of person that people today can still relate to and celebrate those important aspects of his personality that a university like ours can be proud of saying, these are some of the core beliefs that we believe in, which Franklin believed in, that we want to promote.
Very nicely done. Very nicely put indeed. So I think that's quite a nice thing to end on. But before we do, you mentioned 2026. Are there any plans at the university for America 250 celebrations, commemorations, events? I understand that you both held a very successful exhibition last year in 2025. I wonder if you could talk a bit about that and any future exhibitions that might be on the cards.
Absolutely. This university and this city will be consumed by many events in 2026 as we reflect on the anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. As you said, thank you. Yes, Jim and I organized an exhibit that was held in the library where we're speaking to you from last year. We got a jump on things, and that exhibit was called Revolution at Penn, and there was a question mark at the end of that phrase. And we presented much of the history we've been talking about in a way of asking how revolutionary the school was or was not. So that was a jumping off point for us going into the celebrations and commemorations of 2026.
And I would add that we were fortunate in that the provost of the university really liked it and directed that as part of the new undergraduate student orientation, all incoming freshmen would be exposed to some aspects of the exhibit. So the exhibit actually was held over till the end of August so the students could see it. And a presentation was done that all the students had to attend that dealt with some questions of the university and its founding and the revolution.
Right. So we hope we can use these years and these events to teach our own students about the history of their own school. And one of the arguments we like to make is that Penn was not ancillary to the revolution, it was at the center of it. So a lot of our events, we'll keep that idea in mind. We're going to be commemorating, we are commemorating the anniversary of Common Sense in January 2026. We will have an exhibit that actually will deal with later revolutions of powerful impact, the French and Haitian revolutions. So the city will actually be a site to think not just about the Declaration of Independence, of which it will, of course, but also about the entire era of revolutions that can be said to have started with the American Revolution and that consumed Europe, the Americas, the Caribbean, the entire Atlantic world, at least, and has had effects up to the present day. So there will be conferences, there will be talks, and visitors, we hope, from other places coming in to learn more about Philadelphia's history and the history of the school as part of that.
And maybe we'll get a few soccer fans to show up too.
And we should not forget the World Cup, which may be in full swing as you're listening to this podcast with representatives from many nations in our city.
So much going on. And hopefully, if people do find themselves in Philadelphia, they'll be able to stop by and see what's going on at UPenn as well. And that previous exhibition you mentioned, would people be able to find that online at all? Is there any digital way they could engage?
There is a digital part of the exhibit is available on a website online, and we can share that link with your audience where they can learn more about our school's history and some of the dramatic events that we were talking about.
Very nice. Well, that just leaves me to say thank you very much to John Pollack and J.M. Duffin for joining me today to talk about Benjamin Franklin, Philadelphia, and the American Revolution and his role in all of that. So thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you for the invitation.
That was John Pollack and Jim Duffin from the University of Pennsylvania. Join me next time as I'll be talking to the American Philosophical Society, another organization founded by Franklin in Philadelphia, who will tell us about Franklin the scientist and philosopher. Until then, thank you for listening and goodbye.